Danielle Reed. That name they tried to erase. A black woman shoved aside like trash on the wrong side of a police barricade, labeled a nuisance by the very cops who swore to protect her city. The location, Silver Ridge Apartments. Locked down, crawling with SWAT, and 3 live seconds from being wiped out. But here's the kicker: Danielle knew something they didn't. She tried to warn them. She screamed the truth, and what did they do? Slammed her to the pavement. On live stream. Laughed, mocked her, dismissed her. Why? Because she was black. Because she didn't look the part. But they messed up. Big time. Because the woman they silenced, she held the one piece of intel that could stop the bloodbath. And when she finally got a chance to speak just 5 words, the entire SWAT team froze like statues. That moment, it shattered everything. It exposed a system that trains its soldiers to ignore voices like hers. And what happened next didn't just save lives, it forced an entire city to face its ugly truth. Danielle didn't just speak, she roared. Silence isn't weakness. It's the power to make them listen when it matters most. Now, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Let your voice be heard. The street outside Silver Ridge Apartments was locked down tight. Yellow tape stretched across both ends like a noose choking the life out of the block. Police cruisers lined the sidewalks, their lights flickering in silent warning. Armed officers moved in tight formations, radios crackling with clipped orders. Overhead, a news chopper circled like a vulture, waiting for carnage. None of it seemed unusual to the crowd gathered behind the barricades until a black woman in a faded brown jacket stepped forward. Danielle Reed stood still on the cracked sidewalk, hands in her pockets, watching the building as if she could see something the armed men couldn't. Her face held no fear, no confusion, just focus, calculated, sharp, unshaken. But in the eyes of the officers standing guard, she was out of place. Wrong skin, wrong gender, wrong moment. Lieutenant Scott Carter leaned against the hood of a patrol SUV, arms crossed over his chest, chewing gum like he owned the block. His eyes narrowed when he noticed Danielle inching closer to the police tape. He pushed off the vehicle and swaggered toward her, loud enough for the cameras already recording on cell phones. "Hey, old lady, this isn't a charity line," Carter called out, voice thick with sarcasm. People nearby chuckled. "Don't you got somewhere better to be? This is a police operation. You don't belong here." The smirks on the other officers' faces spread like wildfire. Laughter bubbled up, ugly and public. Phones tilted toward the commotion. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She didn't say a word. She simply stood there, her eyes never leaving the windows of Silver Ridge. Carter stepped closer, his boots scraping the concrete. He leaned in like he was daring her to breathe. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or you just standing here, hoping someone hands you a check for playing the victim?" More laughter followed. Danielle didn't move. Carter's face twisted into a sneer. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm. "Move back now. Ma'am, this is your last warning." Danielle turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him for the first time. Her voice, low and firm, cut through the noise. "I live here. Apartment 306. The words landed like dead weight, ignored before they could settle. Carter scoffed loud enough for the cameras. "Yeah, and I'm the damn mayor." He yanked her wrist harder, forcing her toward the ground. "Get your hands behind your back. You're interfering with police business." The crowd gasped as Danielle hit the pavement, one knee in her back. Carter pressed her face toward the dirty sidewalk while bystanders filmed every second. Someone shouted, "Yo, what the hell? She didn't do anything." Another voice added, "She said she lives here," but Carter didn't care. He glanced up, spotting a teenager streaming the incident live. He smirked and leaned closer to Danielle's ear. "Welcome to the internet, ma'am. Say hi to the world." His grip tightened. Danielle didn't resist. She didn't fight back. She let him press her into the ground like she wasn't worth the air she breathed. And as Carter knelt on her back, The view count on the live stream spiked past 30,000. Comments flooded in. Who is she? Why are they doing her like that? Somebody better check her ID. Across the street, more cell phones went up. Reporters started pushing through the barricades, sensing a bigger story. The chants started small, but grew louder. Let her go. Let her go. Matthews, the SWAT commander, approached. Radio pressed to his ear. He glanced toward Carter, irritation flashing across his face. What the hell are you doing? Carter stood up slowly, dragging Danielle with him. She's interfering, sir. Says she lives here. Sounds like bullshit to me. Danielle caught Matthews's eye. Her voice didn't shake. Apartment 306. My name is Danielle Reed. Check the records. Matthews stared at her for a heartbeat longer than anyone expected. Then he snapped his fingers toward Carter. Get her out of here. Now. Carter shoved Danielle backward, pushing her toward the barricade. Phones tracked every step. The crowd exploded. Someone yelled, "She just told you where she lives." Another voice screamed, "Why aren't you checking?" Carter spun around, raising his hands like he was the hero in some cheap drama. "She's nobody. Move along, folks." But Danielle didn't move along. She stood right where he left her, eyes fixed on the building. The SWAT team regrouped. Oblivious to the storm brewing online, the live stream hadn't stopped. In fact, it had gone viral. Screens across the country now replayed the moment Danielle hit the ground, over and over. Hashtags exploded. Black woman, thrown down, check hurried. Who is she? The footage was everywhere. News anchors began breaking in with headlines. Protesters started gathering beyond the tape. But Danielle wasn't watching any of that. She didn't care about trending tags or online outrage. She cared about one thing, what she had already seen inside Silver Ridge. Something none of these officers had noticed. Something they weren't ready to face. Because Danielle Reed knew the trap had already been set, and they were walking straight into it. Danielle stood just beyond the barricade, a step away from where Carter had shoved her. The sting in her shoulder didn't bother her. What bothered her was the way every officer around her had dismissed her existence like she was nothing more than street noise. She kept her eyes on the building, scanning the upper floors, noting the angle of the windows, the sniper positions on nearby rooftops, the tightening posture of the team gathering near the command SUV. She could read the whole scene like a map, but no one here cared to ask how or why. Carter swaggered back toward her with that same smirk plastered on his face. He leaned one elbow on the barricade and shook his head like he couldn't believe she was still standing there. "Didn't I tell you to move along? What's the plan now? Gonna start crying for the cameras. Play the victim some more." His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to keep the crowd stirred up and entertained. Danielle's lips barely moved when she spoke. "You're walking into a kill zone. You don't even see it." Carter laughed like she'd just told the best joke of the year. "Lady, you have no idea who you're talking to." He motioned to the SWAT team nearby. "We've got 20 operators on site, 5 sniper teams, thermal imaging, drones in the air. You think some nobody standing on the sidewalk in a jacket from the 90s is seeing something we aren't." He leaned closer, dropping his voice just enough to make it personal. "Let me guess you watch too much cable news, right? Think you're some kind of armchair general. Danielle didn't move an inch. I live on the 3rd floor. Apartment 306. My name is Danielle Reed. You might want to check the building's records before you fill body bags." The words didn't land the way she hoped. Carter turned his head and laughed even harder. "Records? You want us to check records while we're locking down a hostage situation?" He threw his hands up like she was wasting his time. "Go home, lady, or better yet, turn around and wave to the internet again. You're getting your 15 minutes. Don't stretch it." Danielle didn't move. Matthews stepped closer to the scene, rubbing the back of his neck like the weight of the situation was finally catching up to him. His earpiece buzzed with updates from the negotiation team, all of which had been dead ends. The hostage-taker inside apartment 402 had gone completely silent. No demands, no responses, nothing but a ticking clock. Matthews glanced at Danielle for the first time, really looked at her, like he was trying to figure out if she was actually worth the breath it would take to ask a question. "What did you say your apartment number was?" he asked, his voice flat. Danielle opened her mouth, but Carter cut her off before she could answer. "She's lying. Captain, she's just trying to get attention. She doesn't live here. I already handled it." Danielle's jaw clenched. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She simply repeated, clear and steady, "Apartment 306. My name is Danielle Reed." Matthews squinted, looking at Carter, then back at her. He pulled out his tablet and started typing something. Carter stepped in, trying to block the screen. "Sir, seriously, we don't have time for this." "She's just a..." Matthews held up a hand, cutting him off. The tension in the air shifted. Carter wasn't used to being shut down. Not like this. Danielle watched his face tighten, the fake smile slipping for the first time. Matthews looked like he was considering something deeper, but Carter wasn't about to let that happen. He stepped right up to Danielle again, pushing the barricade aside, closing the distance between them. "Let me make this real simple for you," Carter hissed. "You get one chance to walk away, or I'll make sure you're arrested for obstructing a federal operation. You won't like how that feels." Danielle stared at him, not blinking. "You already put me on the ground. Go ahead and finish it." The words hung between them like a lit fuse. Carter's jaw twitched. His hand balled into a fist at his side, but Matthews spoke before he could move. "Carter, back off. Now." Carter turned, disbelief written all over his face. "You can't be serious." Matthews didn't repeat himself. Carter stood there, looking like a kid caught breaking a rule he didn't think applied to him. Danielle didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, arms crossed, eyes locked on the building. The heat from the afternoon sun pressed down on the concrete, but the real heat was coming from the tension crackling between them. Carter wasn't used to being told no, not in front of his team, not in front of a woman he'd just humiliated. Matthews looked up from his tablet, his expression unreadable. "We've got no record of her on file." Carter spread his arms wide, turning to the team. "What did I tell you?" Danielle took a step forward, ignoring Carter completely. "You're looking in the wrong system. Check federal records. Check classified operations." Carter scoffed, waving her off. "Oh, now you're some kind of spy. What's next? You gonna tell us you're the president's bodyguard?" Danielle didn't answer. She didn't have to. She knew they wouldn't believe her until it was too late. Carter shook his head, backing away like the conversation was over. He leaned toward one of the SWAT operators standing nearby and whispered something under his breath. The operator nodded, not making eye contact with Danielle. Danielle could feel it all closing in again, the dismissal, the erasure, the weight of being treated like she was invisible. But she stayed planted, because she wasn't here to win an argument. She wasn't here for validation. She was here because she had already seen what they hadn't. She was here because something inside that building was counting on them not listening, and they were doing exactly that. 3 weeks earlier, long before the barricades, the snipers, and the viral live stream, Danielle Reed had walked the dimly lit hallway of Silver Ridge alone. It was just past 2 in the morning when she first noticed the shadow near the stairwell on the 4th floor. Most people wouldn't have thought twice about it. The man wore a gray hoodie, his head low, moving without sound. But Danielle's instincts had fired instantly. She didn't see a delivery man or a late-night visitor. She saw the way he carried the oversized black duffel bags, balanced tight against his body, like he knew exactly how to keep them from making noise. She saw the controlled pace of his feet, the way he avoided stepping on the creaky parts of the floor, Most people wouldn't have noticed any of that. She didn't follow him. She didn't need to. She waited until he disappeared around the corner, then made her way straight to the front desk where Victor, the building's night guard, was half asleep behind the glass. "Victor," she called softly, rapping her knuckles on the glass to wake him up. The old man startled, knocking over his half-empty coffee cup. He grumbled as he wiped the mess with a crumpled napkin. "Ms. Reed, it's 2 a.m, he mumbled. "What's going on?" Danielle leaned closer. "You got someone hanging around on the 4th floor. Big guy, gray hoodie, carrying military-grade bags. He's done it more than once. Something's off." Victor sighed like she had just interrupted his favorite show. "You sure it's probably just a tenant moving in or one of those overnight delivery guys?" Danielle didn't blink. "I know what I saw. You need to check it out." Victor leaned back in his chair, stretching like the conversation was already over. "All right, I'll have a look tomorrow." Danielle's jaw tightened. "Not tomorrow. Night." Victor stood, grabbing his flashlight like he was humoring her. "I'll get to it," he promised. But the way he said it told her everything she needed to know. He wouldn't check. He never did. She walked back to her apartment, but her nerves didn't settle. Something wasn't right. The next night, she waited, same time, same hallway, and, like clockwork, the man in the gray hoodie returned, moving just as silently as before. Danielle didn't confront him. She knew better. Instead, she waited until he was gone again and marched straight back to Victor. "He's back," she said through gritted teeth. Victor barely looked up from his phone. "I told you, Ms. Reed. I'll check it out when I can." Danielle pressed her palms against the glass, her voice low but sharp. "You don't get it. That man's not moving furniture. He's moving something else. Something dangerous." Victor rolled his eyes and leaned back, folding his arms. "Come on. You've been living here for years. You really think something like that's going down in this building?" Danielle nodded once. "I do." Victor let out a dry laugh. "Look, I'll file a report if that makes you feel better, but unless you got a badge, there's not much more I can do." Danielle knew that was a lie. He could have reviewed the security cameras. He could have called the property manager. He could have logged an official alert, but none of that happened. The report was never filed. The cameras were never checked, and the man kept coming back. A week later, the smell hit her. A chemical sting in the air as she passed apartment 402. Faint, but sharp. Danielle knew that smell. Nitrate compounds. It wasn't paint. It wasn't bleach. It wasn't cleaning supplies. It was the kind of chemical signature you learned to recognize if you'd ever handled explosives. Danielle stood outside the door for a long moment, breathing through her nose, locking that scent into memory. She knocked twice. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. She pressed her ear to the door. Silence. Danielle walked back downstairs and demanded to speak to the building manager the next morning. Paul Benton, a man in his late 50s with a comb-over and a cheap suit, barely let her finish her sentence before brushing her off. "Ma'am, our tenants have a right to privacy. We can't just go kicking in doors because you think you smell something funny." Danielle clenched her fists at her sides. "I'm not guessing. I'm telling you, that unit needs to be checked. Now." Benton gave her a customer service smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Look, I'll send someone up there later this week. You see anything else? You let me know." Danielle leaned in, lowering her voice. "By the time you check, it might be too late." Benton's smile dropped. His tone sharpened. "I've got protocols to follow. You've made your report. We're done here." Danielle left his office, knowing exactly what that meant. Nothing would happen. No one would check. No one would care until something exploded or someone died. She sat in her apartment that night, staring at the hallway through the peephole, waiting to see that gray hoodie one more time. But he never showed again, not in the hallway, not on the cameras, not anywhere, till today. Danielle had recognized his stance from 50 yards away, his profile, his presence, all of it burned into her memory like it had never left. But today wasn't about catching a criminal anymore. It was bigger than that. Danielle knew this wasn't some desperate man with a gun looking for attention. This wasn't a hostage situation spun out of control. This was a setup, a long game, a message waiting to be delivered in the loudest, most violent way possible. And she was standing outside watching the people with guns and radios walk right into it. Danielle's hands tightened into fists as she watched the SWAT team reposition. From where she stood behind the barricades, she could see every move they were making. To the untrained eye, it looked clean, efficient, professional. But to her, it looked like suicide. She had seen this exact setup before, years ago, in a different city with different uniforms but the same arrogance. Caracus, 2006. A unit of American operators had walked into what they thought was a controlled takedown. They had the high ground, the intel, the gear. What they did not have was respect for the man waiting inside. That man had turned a single apartment into a death trap, baiting them to enter from the most predictable point. They lost 8 good soldiers in less than 60 seconds. Danielle had buried those men herself. And now, standing here watching Captain Matthews spread out the building's blueprint on the hood of the command vehicle, she felt that old dread crawling back up her spine. She scanned the positioning again. The snipers were too tight on the west side. The breach team was stacking on the back stairwell. The rooftop unit was moving into place, ready to drop down through the skylight of apartment 402. It was textbook, too textbook. And that was the problem. Simon Brooks wasn't some random criminal. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't desperate. He was waiting for them to do exactly what they were about to do. Danielle knew the angles. She knew the dead space behind that door. She knew how easy it was to wire a drop charge above an entry point and wipe out an entire team before their boots even touched the floor. She had trained men to do it. She had trained Simon to do it. Her pulse quickened. She couldn't stand there another second. Danielle ducked under the tape and started moving toward Matthews, her voice steady but urgent. "Captain Matthews, you're walking into a trap." Matthews didn't look up. He kept talking to his team, pointing at the diagram. Danielle raised her voice. "The rooftop is compromised. He's baiting you." This time, Matthews did glance up, but it was Carter who reacted first. He stepped into Danielle's path like a wall, planting his palm on her shoulder and forcing her back toward the barricade. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Carter hissed under his breath. "I told you to stay out of this." Danielle pushed his hand off her shoulder. "I'm trying to save lives. You're about to lose half your team." Carter's jaw clenched. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "Lady, this is your last warning. One more word, and I'll have you in cuffs before you can blink." Danielle didn't back down. She took another step forward, ignoring the way Carter's hand hovered near his holster. "He's using your playbook against you. You're giving him everything he wants." Matthews finally stepped between them, holding up a hand. "Enough, both of you." His eyes flicked to Danielle. "You have something worth hearing. Say it now." Danielle didn't hesitate. "He's wired the ceiling above the rooftop entry. If you breach from there, you're dead before you hit the floor. The angles are wrong. Your snipers are exposed. Your backup is too far to respond if it goes sideways. You're being funneled into a kill zone." Matthews narrowed his eyes, studying her face like he was trying to see past the jacket, past the worn boots, past the color of her skin. Carter scoffed loudly. "She's making it up, just trying to get attention." Danielle turned to face Carter directly, her voice cutting through his. "This isn't a guess. This is experience. Caracas, 2006. You can check the records. We lost 8 operators in less than a minute because they did exactly what you're about to do." Matthews's brow furrowed. He glanced down at the blueprint again, tracing the rooftop entry with his finger. Danielle leaned closer, lowering her voice so only Matthews could hear. "He's not improvising. He's executing a plan I taught him." Matthews stared at her for a beat longer, then turned to Carter. "Get her off my scene. Now." Danielle's stomach dropped as Carter grabbed her by the arm again, pulling her back toward the barricade. She twisted out of his grip, planting her feet. "You're making a mistake." Carter shoved her harder this time, pushing her against the metal fencing. "And you're done talking," he snapped. His hand tightened on her arm as if daring her to fight back, but Danielle didn't flinch. She leaned in close, her words like a blade. "When your team doesn't come out, remember this moment. Remember that you chose ego over listening." Carter's face turned red, his grip tightening, but Matthews had already turned away, refocusing on the blueprint. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. She could see it happening all over again, the breach, the explosion, the aftermath, and once again, she was standing outside, powerless, watching people walk to their deaths. She pressed her palms against the cold metal barrier, her heart pounding. This wasn't Caracas. This was home, and she wasn't going to stand here and watch it happen again. Danielle knew she couldn't stay silent. Not now, not again. The weight of every bad decision Danielle had seen in her career pressed against her chest as she watched Matthews lean over the blueprint again. It was right there in front of them, a flawless trap disguised as tactical brilliance. They were about to do exactly what Simon wanted. Danielle knew she had already pushed the limit, but standing there doing nothing wasn't an option anymore. She took a breath, stepped back toward the command vehicle, and forced her voice over the hum of radios and moving. "If you breach from the rooftop, you're sending them all to die," she said loud enough for Matthews to hear. The words cut through the air like a razor. Several SWAT officers glanced up from their gear. Carter whipped his head toward her, fury flashing across his face. Matthews straightened slowly, locking eyes with Danielle like he was trying to decide if she was worth one more second of his time. Carter didn't wait. He charged toward her, jaw clenched, fists tight. "That's it," he growled. "I gave you your warnings. You're done." He grabbed her wrist again, twisting it hard enough to send a jolt of pain up her arm. Danielle didn't pull away. She stood her ground, staring straight at Matthews. "They won't make it to the door," she warned again. "He's using your rooftop breach as bait. He's rigged the ceiling. You're about to walk right into it." Carter yanked her arm harder. "Shut up," he hissed through his teeth. "You don't know anything about this operation." Danielle leaned in, her voice low and sharp. "I know more than you ever will." Carter lost it. He spun her around, shoving her face first against the side of the SUV. His hand moved to his cuffs. "You're under arrest for interfering with a federal operation." Several officers turned toward the scene, hesitation flickering in their eyes. Matthews didn't move. He kept staring at Danielle like the weight of something bigger was starting to land on him. Danielle felt the cold steel of the cuffs brush against her wrist. She closed her eyes for half a second, knowing she was one word away from being removed entirely. Then she spoke again, this time louder, locking her voice on Matthews like a laser. "Look me up. Danielle Reed, apartment 306, former Delta Force, Tempest Command." The words hit the air like a live round. Matthews flinched. Carter froze mid-motion, the cuff hanging loose in his hand. Danielle used the silence to drive it home. "Caracas, 2006. I was there. I led the team. 8 men died because we walked into a trap exactly like this." Matthews's face darkened. His hand hovered over the radio clipped to his vest. Carter started to speak, but Matthews cut him off with a single raised finger. "Let her go," Matthews ordered. Carter hesitated like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. "Sir, you can't be serious." Matthews's voice sharpened. "I said, let her go." Carter's jaw flexed, but he unclipped the cuff and stepped back, breathing hard. Danielle rubbed her wrist, turning to face Matthews fully now. She didn't flinch. "He's got you lined up. Every move you're making, he's already prepared for. You breach that roof, you're dead before your boots hit the floor." Matthews kept his eyes on her, like he was seeing her for the first time. His fingers tapped the edge of the blueprint, tracing the rooftop entry again. "Tempest Command," he asked under his breath, almost like he was talking to himself. Danielle nodded once. "You can verify it, but if you wait too long, it won't matter." Carter took a step forward again, anger burning in his voice. "Sir, this is insane. She's bluffing. She's making it up to sound important." Danielle didn't take her eyes off Matthews. "I don't need to sound important. I need to stop you from killing your team." Matthews pulled out his tablet again, typing quickly. The tension in the air grew heavier by the second. Carter hovered, looking like a man on the edge of losing control. "You can't seriously be wasting time on this," he muttered. "She's just some washed-up." Matthews cut him off again, this time louder. "Enough." The entire team fell silent. Matthews glanced toward the tactical tech officer standing a few feet away. "Run the name." "Danielle Reed, cross-check military archives, Delta Force, Operation Tempest." The tech officer nodded, already pulling up secure channels on his device. Carter scoffed, shaking his head. "You're wasting time. We've got lives on the line. She's feeding you stories." Danielle finally turned to face Carter directly. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It came out cold and certain. "You silenced me once. You won't do it again." Matthews kept staring at her like the puzzle pieces were starting to click into place. His jaw tightened. His radio buzzed again, the negotiation team reporting no change. The building remained silent. No demands, no movement, no signals, just a ticking clock. Matthews didn't speak right away. He kept his eyes locked on Danielle, studying every inch of her face like he was trying to decide if the voice standing in front of him was a threat or the last chance he had to prevent a disaster. The tech officer's fingers flew across his device. A bead of sweat rolled down Carter's temple. Matthews tapped his radio twice, then took a step closer to Danielle. He didn't blink when he asked the next question. "Who the hell are you really?" The air felt like it had thickened around the command vehicle as Matthews stood frozen, staring at Danielle. His fingers hovered over the screen of his tablet, and for the first time since the standoff began, his voice wasn't commanding or impatient. It was cautious. "Delta Force. Tempest. That's a big claim," he muttered under his breath. Carter stood to the side, pacing like a dog straining at its leash, throwing Danielle sharp glances filled with contempt. Matthews didn't wait for further debate. He turned to the tech specialist, jerking his chin toward the secure data terminal set up on the back of the vehicle. "Pull up the classified archive. Tempest, 2006. See if anything comes up with the name Danielle Reed." The tech hesitated for half a second before typing furiously. A loading symbol spun on the screen while the team around them watched in confused silence. Carter finally broke, scoffing loud enough for all to hear. "Are you kidding me? You're actually running with this?" She shows up out of nowhere, throws out some top-secret name from a decade ago, and you're treating it like gospel. Matthews didn't answer. His jaw tightened as he leaned in closer to the screen. Carter wasn't done. He threw his hands up and stepped closer. "Sir, this is tactical theater. This is exactly how people insert themselves to mess up real operations. She's bluffing. She's feeding you fantasy." Danielle didn't move. She didn't flinch. She let Carter spiral while Matthews read the first line of the declassified entry that flashed on the screen. His face went still. He scrolled, absorbing the data line by line. Danielle watched his throat tighten as he processed the details. "Command Unit Tempest, 2006 Syria. Black Site Authorization. Confirmed Mission Leader Commander D. Reed. Status Eyes Only Access Danielle Reed." Matthews slowly turned the screen so Carter could see. Carter leaned in, expecting to debunk it, expecting to prove his superiority one last time, but his smirk died the second his eyes locked on the words. He blinked, leaned closer, and blinked again. This has to be some kind of mistake. Matthews didn't look away from Carter when he spoke next. "It's not a mistake. It's sealed. Eyes only clearance, but it's real. Carter's face drained of color, and for the first time, he stepped back, swallowing hard. You're actually, Her Matthews turned back to Danielle. Commander Reed. Danielle didn't react. She had spent too many years letting that title die in the shadows. She wasn't here for rank. She wasn't here for recognition. She nodded once, slow and steady. I told you. And if you had listened the first time, we wouldn't be here. Matthews looked at the blueprint again, and the weight of realization settled on him like a slab of concrete. He exhaled slowly, then turned to his team. Hold all breach operations, no movement until further notice. The comms officer repeated the order across all channels, and the perimeter team stopped repositioning. SWAT operators exchanged confused looks, but obeyed without question. Carter stood frozen, unable to speak, his jaw working but no words coming out. Matthews faced Danielle again, his tone shifting. If you're right about the rooftop, and from what I just read, I'm guessing you are. What do you need? Danielle didn't hesitate. 20 minutes, no breach teams, no drones, no pushing forward. I need someone on your team who actually knows how to listen. Matthews looked around, clearly weighing who he could trust. Carter started to open his mouth again, but Matthews shot him a glare sharp enough to stop him cold. He turned back to Danielle. You've got your 20 minutes. Who do you want? Danielle glanced toward the team huddled near the comms truck. Her eyes landed on a young Latina officer standing slightly apart from the rest. Her posture sharp, her face unreadable, her earpiece still active. Danielle pointed at her without hesitation. Her, Lieutenant Cruz. Carter let out a bitter laugh under his breath, shaking his head. Unbelievable. We're putting this entire operation in the hands of a washed-up has-been and a rookie negotiator. Matthews rounded on Carter so fast the younger man actually flinched. Enough. Carter, you've done enough damage today. You're benched. Stay out of the way, or I'll have you escorted off this site. Carter stood there, fists clenched at his sides, rage burning in his eyes, but he said nothing. Matthews turned back to Danielle. Lieutenant Cruz is yours. You've got 20 minutes. After that, if I don't see results, this goes back to my team. Danielle nodded, stepping toward the young officer. Cruz didn't hesitate. She moved toward Danielle with calm precision, her face set, her hands steady. Matthews watched them walk off toward the side of the perimeter where the blueprints and surveillance monitors were set up. He rubbed his face, exhaling like the weight of the entire city had just shifted onto his shoulders. For the first time all day, Matthews wasn't sure who was really in charge, and he wasn't sure he cared. As long as his people came out alive, Danielle didn't look back. She had no time for bruised egos. She had 20 minutes to stop a massacre, and all she needed now was someone who knew how to listen. Rachel Cruz followed Danielle closely, weaving through the clusters of officers still processing the shock of what had just happened. Danielle didn't waste time explaining. She moved with the kind of purpose Cruz recognized in people who had seen too much to care about small talk. They stopped behind a utility truck parked at the edge of the perimeter, just far enough from the others to speak without being overheard. Danielle leaned against the side of the truck and finally turned to Cruz, studying the younger woman's face for a moment as if she were measuring whether she could handle the truth. Cruz didn't flinch. She folded her arms and waited. Danielle nodded slightly, accepting the silent challenge. I trained him, Danielle said flatly. Simon Brooks, the man you've got locked inside apartment 402 with 3 hostages, I trained him in this exact building. Cruz's brows knit together, processing the statement like she was sure she'd misheard. You trained him. Here, Danielle nodded again. Silver Ridge was a black site training facility 20 years ago. urban shadow. We used apartment 402 as the primary close-quarters battle scenario. Simon was one of my best recruits. We called him Echo Zero. Fastest student I ever had to map an interior space blindfolded. He could rig traps from nothing, string tripwires through air vents, build kill zones without leaving a fingerprint. Cruz leaned back slightly, glancing toward the building with a new layer of horror settling over her expression. So, this isn't random. He came back to the place you trained him. Danielle's jaw tensed. Not for revenge, for recognition. He wants them to remember who he was before they erased him. Cruz shook her head, trying to connect the dots. But why take hostages? Why now? Danielle exhaled slowly, her eyes never leaving the upper floors of the building, because this place was the last time he belonged somewhere. After Beirut, after everything went sideways, they wiped his name from the records, pretended he never existed. I know, because they did the same to me. Cruz stayed silent, letting the weight of those words settle. Danielle pressed on. He cracked after Beirut, started hearing things, seeing things. Back then, we didn't have the words for it. PTSD wasn't something they talked about in our line of work. They called him unstable, unfit. They cut him loose and left him to rot. Cruz's voice dropped, and Danielle's lips curled into something between a smile and a grimace. Same ending, different chapter. I survived one black site too many. They needed to clean house. Erasing names is easier than admitting they broke their own. She looked back at Cruz, her face like stone. Simon isn't a terrorist. He's a ghost, and I made him. Cruz swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. If you trained him to build traps, then you're the only one who knows how to take them apart. Danielle nodded, pushing off the truck. That's why I need you to listen. Every wall, every vent, every blind spot in that apartment is part of a map I designed. I know where he's hiding. I know where he's watching from, and I know where he's laid the real trap. Cruz fell into step beside her as Danielle started moving again, weaving through the outer ring of SWAT units. We need to check the east side of the 4th floor, Danielle said. Behind the drywall near apartment 404. There's a hollow cavity between the walls. It's not on any of the civilian blueprints. We built it for surveillance exercises. It's big enough to hide a man or a bomb. Cruz followed without question, her pulse quickening. If he's in there, or if he's rigged it, the whole team is exposed. Danielle nodded. Exactly. And if we move the wrong way, we trigger whatever he's waiting to unleash. Cruz glanced back toward the command post where Matthews was still talking to his team. Carter pacing like a caged animal. You think they'll give us the time to check it? Danielle didn't answer right away. She knew they wouldn't wait long. Time was the one thing they never had enough of. But she wasn't here to ask for permission. She was here to stop what she had started years ago. They reached the north side of the building where a maintenance hatch provided access to the outer wall of apartment 404. Danielle paused, pressing her palm against the surface, closing her eyes like she was listening to something deeper than the hum of the city. Cruz watched her, holding her breath without realizing it. Danielle knocked lightly 3 times on the wall. The echo that came back wasn't solid. It wasn't hollow either. It had the compressed vibration of a hidden chamber. Danielle opened her eyes and turned to Cruz, her voice barely a whisper. He's following the playbook I wrote for him, and we're standing on the edge of the final move. Cruz felt the cold grip of reality tighten around them both. She didn't need any more convincing. Danielle stepped back, looking up toward the darkened windows above. She knew Simon was in there, watching, waiting. She could almost feel his breath on the back of her neck like the memory had never left. The only way to stop him was to step back into the very hell she had built for him, and she knew it. Danielle stood in front of the narrow stretch of drywall just outside apartment 404, her fingers tracing the faded paint like she could still feel the blueprint beneath it. Cruz stood silently at her side, glancing back over her shoulder every few seconds as if expecting someone to come charging in to shut them down. The building was too quiet, too still, like the air itself knew what they were standing on. Danielle stepped back, tapped her knuckles twice against the surface, then pressed her ear against it. She didn't expect to hear anything. If Simon had followed his training to the letter, the space would be sealed tight, soundproofed from the inside. But it wasn't sound she was after. It was the weight of the structure itself, the faint difference in how the vibrations carried. And she heard it. A gap, a space just wide enough to hide a man, or worse, something that could bring the entire floor down in seconds. Cruz leaned in, her voice low. "You're sure?" Danielle didn't hesitate. "He's in there, or he's rigged it. It's the only place he could watch the team from without being seen, and if he wired it the way I think he did, breaching from the roof will trigger a chain reaction." Cruz pressed her lips together, eyes flicking toward the staircase where 2 SWAT officers stood on standby, still waiting for Matthews's next order. Danielle knew they wouldn't wait long. Time was slipping. She turned back toward the wall, pressing her palm flat against it. "We need to scan for RF signals. If he's using remote triggers, they'll be bouncing off this cavity." Cruz nodded and reached for her comms, but Danielle grabbed her wrist before she could press the button. "Not over the open channel. We do this quiet. Carter's already looking for ways to shut me down." Cruz swallowed hard and lowered her hand. Across the hall, hidden just out of their line of sight, Carter stood with his back against the wall, watching them through the reflection in the window pane of a nearby door. His jaw tightened as he listened, his fingers already moving to his own radio, switching to a private frequency. "Control. This is Carter," he whispered. "Initiate independent signal verification. Cross-check everything that woman's saying. I want confirmation she's bluffing." "Copy." The reply crackled softly in his earpiece. "Copy. Run and scan now. Results in 5. Carter smirked to himself, convinced this would be the final nail in Danielle's credibility. He leaned back, arms crossed, watching the 2 women like a man waiting for a bet to pay off. Danielle didn't know exactly what Carter was doing, but she felt the shift in the air, the pull of someone working against her in the shadows. She turned to Cruz, lowering her voice even more. "We need a direct line to your tech team. Someone you trust, no one else." Cruz nodded, pulling out her personal comms unit, bypassing the main channel entirely. She whispered into the receiver, "Tech 1, this is Cruz. I need an immediate RF scan on the east wall cavity near apartment 404. Discreet, no cross-channel verification. Just run it and report back to me directly." The pause on the other end felt like a lifetime before a quiet voice finally replied, "Copy. Scanning now. Stand by." Danielle closed her eyes, trying to calculate how many ways Simon could have rigged the space. Pressure plates, tripwires, motion sensors, thermal triggers. She had taught him every one of them. But if he followed the old protocols, there would be an RF-based secondary trigger, something remote that gave him control without being physically connected. If they could detect that signal, they'd know for sure. She stepped back, staring at the wall like it might breathe if she looked hard enough. Cruz's comms crackled again. 3 signals detected. Low frequency, originating from within the wall cavity. Confirmed live. Cruz's eyes widened as she turned to Danielle. 3 signals. It's hot. Danielle nodded slowly. That's the kill switch. Carter, still listening from his hidden spot, frowned. His own comms chirped in his ear. Control to Carter. No abnormal signals detected on main sweep. Negative confirmation on target's claim. Carter's grin returned. He keyed his mic. Copy. Just what I thought. He stepped out from behind the corner, walking toward Danielle and Cruz with that same arrogant sway, clapping his hands together like he'd just solved the case. Well, looks like our expert here is batting zero. Tech team says your so-called trap doesn't exist. Danielle turned, narrowing her eyes at him. You're running the wrong sweep. Of course you'd get nothing. Carter shook his head, raising his voice just enough for the nearby officers to hear, or maybe you're just making it up as you go along, scaring everyone into thinking you're the only one who can save the day. Cruz started to speak, but Danielle lifted her hand to stop her. She took a step toward Carter, closing the space between them until they were nearly face to face. Her voice dropped to a level only he could hear. Keep playing this game, Lieutenant, and when this place blows, your name's the one they'll carve into the headline, not mine. Carter's jaw flexed. But before he could respond, Cruz's comms buzzed again. Tech 1 to Cruz. Confirmed 3 RF signals active. Recommend immediate tactical halt. Cruz's face went pale as she turned to Danielle. They confirmed it. You're right. Danielle didn't waste a second. She turned toward the command center, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. We need a full localized RF suppression. Now. The moment Danielle's voice hit the air, the entire command post shifted. Matthews stood near the mobile operations table, eyeing the team of technicians huddled over the signal monitors. Cruz followed Danielle in fast, relaying the private confirmation she had just received. 3 active RF signals, Cruz announced, not bothering to soften the delivery. Confirmed by Tech 1, off channel. Matthews straightened, tension locking his jaw. He turned to the lead tech. Verify that sweep now. Full spectrum, direct calibration. The tech nodded without hesitation, already rerouting the equipment. Fingers flying across the keyboard, the monitors refreshed, recalibrating the scan. Carter stormed in from the far end of the lot, shaking his head like he was watching a circus. Unbelievable. He muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. You're still letting this woman run the show. Matthews ignored him, eyes locked on the data streaming across the screen. One blip appeared, then a second, then a third. Low-frequency pulses, faint but undeniable, all pinging from the exact coordinates Danielle had called out. 3 separate RF signals inside the east wall cavity of apartment 402. The tech confirmed. All live, all active. A hush fell over the team. Cruz turned to Danielle, eyes wide but steady. Danielle simply nodded. Matthews leaned forward, staring at the pattern on the monitor like it might jump off the screen and kill them all. Jesus Christ, he muttered. It's wired. Danielle spoke again, her voice low but cutting through the tension like a blade. You breach that roof. You trigger all 3. It's not just one bomb. It's a chain reaction. Carter's lip curled into a sneer. Or maybe you had someone feed that data in while we weren't watching, he snapped. Convenient how the only confirmation we have is coming from her people. Danielle turned to face him fully, stepping in closer, her fists clenched at her sides. I've already saved your team once. You still want to bet their lives on your pride? Carter didn't flinch. He took another step toward her, voice rising enough to turn heads. Or maybe you're just another loudmouth looking to be the hero. Typical. Play the race card, flash some fake military story, and watch everyone fall in line. Guess it works when you're black and loud enough. The words landed like a slap across the entire command post. Heads turned, techs froze, operators stiffened. Cruz's face darkened instantly. She stepped between them without hesitation, squaring her shoulders as if she'd just been shot. Lieutenant Carter, she said loud and clear, her voice trembling with controlled rage. If you open your mouth one more time to spit that garbage, I will personally file for your suspension on grounds of misconduct and racial harassment. Carter scoffed, but there was a flicker of panic in his eyes. Cruz wasn't bluffing. She planted her feet, refusing to break eye contact. "Try me." Matthews raised his hand before Carter could fire back. "Enough! Carter, stand down, now!" Carter's jaw locked, his nostrils flaring, but the weight of the room had already shifted. No one was backing him, not this time. He stood frozen, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides like he wanted to throw the whole command table to the ground. But he didn't move. Matthews turned back to the tech team. "Pull all active units back from the rooftop now. Full stop. Nobody moves until I say otherwise." The order rang through the comms. Operators in black tactical gear paused mid-step, waiting for further instructions. Danielle stepped back toward the table, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "He's not just watching you. He's daring you to take the bait. Those bombs aren't there to kill the hostages. They're there to kill your team and send a message to the whole city. You need to lock down that signal now." Matthews nodded, signaling the tech. "Activate the RF jammer. Full suppression on the east side." The tech confirmed, flicking a series of switches. The green light on the jammer unit blinked to red, indicating active suppression. Matthews leaned forward, hands flat on the table, staring at Danielle like the weight of everything he had ignored was finally sinking in. This whole thing was never about the hostages, was it? He asked quietly. Danielle shook her head. No, it was about being heard, about forcing the system to remember who he is. And if you keep pushing without listening, you're going to hand him exactly what he wants on camera, in front of the world. Matthews nodded once, then turned to Cruz. "Lieutenant, she's yours. You and Commander Reed are running point on this until I say otherwise." Cruz nodded, glancing at Danielle with a flicker of something close to respect. Danielle didn't waste a second. She pointed back toward the building. "Let's move. We're running out of time." As they turned toward the east access stairwell, Carter stayed rooted in place, burning with silent rage. No one was looking at him now. The control had shifted. The spotlight had moved. And standing right in the middle of it was the black woman he had tried to silence twice. The woman who had just forced the entire operation to stop with nothing but the truth. Danielle didn't waste time trading looks or celebrating small wins. She motioned for Cruz to follow her back toward the operations table where Matthews stood waiting. Carter remained planted near the perimeter, arms crossed, fists clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. He looked like he was ready to snap, but Danielle had something left to bury him with, something that would rip away the last bit of ground he thought he stood on. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small, battered tablet. The screen was scratched, the casing dented, but it powered on with a soft hum. She unlocked it, scrolled to a secured video file, and turned the screen toward Matthews without a word. Cruz leaned in first, squinting at the grainy footage that began to play. It was black and white, infrared surveillance, time-stamped from 3 nights ago at 46 a.m. The camera feed showed the east side of the building, zoomed in on the 4th-floor window of apartment 402. A small dot of light flickered at the base of the window frame. Danielle tapped the screen, freezing the frame. She zoomed in slowly, revealing a tiny copper-colored motion sensor, barely visible against the glass. Matthews leaned closer, his face tightening. The video played again, showing the faint outline of a thin wire running along the frame, disappearing into the wall. Danielle turned the tablet toward Carter next, holding it steady in front of his face. "This was recorded before your team even showed up," she said flatly. "I've been tracking this for weeks. You couldn't see it because you didn't know where to look. You didn't want to look." Carter's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The color drained from his face as he glanced at Matthews, searching for some kind of lifeline. Matthews gave him none. He turned to the tech team. "Confirm this footage against our building schematics. Cross-check the timestamp with surveillance logs. The lead technician nodded. Already pulling up files. Danielle didn't take her eyes off Carter. You mocked me. You humiliated me. And you risked your entire team because you couldn't get past your own ego. Carter finally snapped, his voice cracking as he pointed at Danielle. This is staged. Anyone could have faked that feed. You expect us to believe Matthews raised his hand sharply, cutting him off mid-sentence. You're done. Lieutenant. Carter froze, blinking like he hadn't heard correctly. What? Matthews stepped closer, lowering his voice but making sure everyone around them could still hear. You're off this operation, effective immediately. Stand down and leave the command area, now. Carter looked around, desperate for anyone to back him up. No one moved. Cruz stood silently beside Danielle, her expression locked in stone. The techs avoided eye contact. Even the perimeter officers kept their distance. Carter shook his head slowly, his jaw twitching. You can't be serious. After everything Matthews didn't flinch. You're relieved. Walk, or I'll have you escorted out. Carter stood frozen for a heartbeat longer before finally stepping back. His fists trembled at his sides, but the fight had drained from his face. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the outer perimeter. 2 uniformed officers fell in behind him, making sure he didn't double back. Danielle watched him go, feeling nothing but the weight of unfinished business pressing on her shoulders. The air inside the command post shifted again. Lighter but sharper, like everyone had finally realized who had been steering them in the wrong direction all along. Matthews turned to Danielle, his voice steady. It's your operation now. What's next? Danielle opened her mouth to answer, but the comms officer cut in, his voice tight with surprise. Captain, incoming message from the suspect. Matthews spun toward the radio unit. Put it through. The tech nodded, adjusting the frequency. The speakers crackled to life with heavy static, followed by a single voice, hoarse, low, but unmistakably deliberate. I'll talk, but only to Danielle Reed. Cruz and Matthews exchanged quick glances, but Danielle's face didn't move. She had been waiting for this. Matthews nodded to the tech, signaling to open the channel. Danielle leaned in, her voice cold and steady. I'm here. The command post fell completely silent the moment Danielle's voice broke through the radio. No one dared to move. Cruz stood motionless beside her, watching the static buzz on the speaker as if the air itself had frozen. Matthews kept his hands planted on the edge of the operations table, his jaw tight, waiting for something to make sense. For a few tense seconds, there was nothing but dead air. Then the speaker crackled again, the sound raw, broken, like someone had dragged it out of a tunnel. It's you, the voice rasped. Simon Brooks. The weight of his breath could almost be felt through the static. You're alive. Danielle didn't blink. She leaned in closer to the mic, her voice controlled, steady as steel. I'm here. Simon. There was a long pause on the other end, the kind that made everyone in the room shift on their feet. The sound of Simon's breathing was uneven, like he was trying to process something impossible. They told us you were dead, he muttered. After Latakia, after the unit burned. They told us you were gone. Danielle closed her eyes for half a second, feeling the memories claw at the edges of her mind like broken glass. They lied, she whispered, just like they lied about you. Cruz swallowed hard, glancing toward Matthews, but he didn't interrupt. No one did. The air inside the command post felt heavier than ever. Simon's voice cracked again, rough with disbelief. No, you're dead. They erased you. I looked for you. For years. You disappeared. Danielle leaned in even closer, lowering her voice to a frequency only someone from their past would understand. Echo 0. This is Viper 6. Confirm contact. Break protocol. Standing by for extraction. The moment the old call sign left her lips, Simon's breath caught audibly on the other end. His reply came slower, shakier, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Viper 6. God, it's really you. Cruz closed her eyes, barely exhaling. Matthew's hands curled tighter on the table. Danielle pressed on, her voice unwavering. I never left you, Simon. I never forgot. The line went dead silent again. No breathing, no static, nothing. Danielle kept her eyes locked on the radio, waiting. Cruz leaned in, whispering close to her ear. What does that mean? Danielle's lips barely moved. It means I'm the only one he's going to trust from this point forward. Matthews spoke up quietly, careful not to break the fragile moment. Ask him what he wants. Danielle nodded slightly, reaching for the mic again. Simon, tell me what you need. Static cracked again before Simon's voice returned. Raw and uneven. No more lies. No more tricks. No more SWAT. No more orders. Just you. Face to face. Cruz stiffened, but Danielle nodded without hesitation. All right, just me. But you have to let me come in safe. No traps. No surprises. Another pause. Then Simon spoke again. Softer this time. You come alone. No weapons. No wires. You know the rules. You taught me. Danielle nodded again, more to herself than to anyone else. She already knew this was where it was going. She turned to Matthews and Cruz, her expression unflinching. I'm going in alone. Matthews straightened instantly. That's not happening. Danielle didn't back down. It's the only way. If I don't, he'll set off those charges and you'll lose everyone. Cruz grabbed Danielle's arm, pulling her a step back from the mic. That's suicide, she hissed under her breath. You don't know what he's done in there. You don't know if he's stable. Danielle locked eyes with her. I know him better than anyone else in this building. I built him. I trained him. I left him behind. This ends with me, one way or another. Matthews ran a hand over his face, clearly fighting every instinct as a commander to shut this down. If you go in there, we lose control of the scene. Danielle leaned in. You never had control. The words hit harder than she expected. Matthews stared at her for a long, tense moment, then finally nodded once, slow and heavy. You go in, he said quietly, but you check in every 30 seconds. No exceptions. Danielle shook her head. Simon will know if I'm carrying comms. He trained to sweep for signals. I can't take anything in with me. Cruz's throat tightened. You're walking into a bomb with nothing. Danielle nodded, and I'll walk out with him if you let me do it my way. Matthews looked like he wanted to argue, but the crackle of the radio snapped everyone back to attention. Simon's voice returned, low but direct. I'm waiting. Danielle didn't hesitate. She picked up the mic one last time. I'm coming in. Danielle stood at the edge of the inner perimeter, staring down the long hallway that led to apartment 402. Every light above her seemed too bright, too clinical, like they were exposing her every step before she had even taken it. SWAT officers flanked the corridor entrances, frozen in position, their weapons lowered but their bodies ready to respond the second something went wrong. Matthews stood by the mobile command post, gripping his radio like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the ground. Cruz followed close behind Danielle, her voice tight with tension. You don't have to do this, she whispered, stepping in front of her to block her path. We can find another way. There's still time to set up a remote feed, something small. He won't detect it if we... Danielle raised a hand, cutting her off. Her voice dropped to a whisper that held more weight than a shout. I taught him how to detect signals. I trained him to sweep for frequencies. You plant one mic on me, he'll know before I take a second step. Cruz swallowed, knowing Danielle was right, but unable to accept it. At least take something. A wire, a panic button, anything. Danielle shook her head. No tech, no weapons, no lies. It's the only way he'll listen. Matthews approached slowly. His jaw locked, his face hard as stone. He stopped just a few feet away, staring at her like he wanted to stop her more than anything, but knowing he couldn't. "You cross that threshold," he warned. "We have no control. If he takes you, if he closes that door, you're on your own." Danielle met his gaze without blinking. "I know." Matthews didn't lower his radio. His knuckles turned white around it. "I can't authorize this." Danielle let out a breath that sounded more like she was releasing 20 years of silence. "Good thing I didn't ask for your permission." Matthews flinched slightly, but he didn't argue. He knew there was no stopping her. Cruz stepped closer again, her hand curling into a fist at her side. "What do I tell them if you don't come back out?" Danielle finally turned to face Cruz, placing a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Tell them to remember who they're really fighting for." With that, Danielle turned toward the hallway and took her first step. The concrete floor echoed under her boots as she walked, the sound of her breath louder than the faint hum of the overhead lights. Every step felt heavier, not with fear, but with the weight of what she was walking back into. She reached the edge of the barricade where the SWAT officers stood frozen. One of them glanced toward Matthews as if waiting for the final green light to block her. Matthews didn't move. He didn't say a word. Danielle nodded once, stepped past the barricade, and walked toward the door of apartment 402. Cruz stood at the edge of the command post, her breath catching as she watched Danielle's back move further and further away. She pressed her lips together to keep from shouting after her. Matthews finally broke the silence, his voice low and bitter. No weapon, no backup, just the woman who made him. Cruz didn't take her eyes off Danielle, and the only one who might bring him back. Danielle reached the door. It was slightly ajar, just wide enough to invite her in, but narrow enough to feel like the edge of a blade. She placed her hand on the door frame, pausing for half a second, listening. There was no sound from the other side, no movement, just that heavy silence pressing down on her like a held breath. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The moment her boot crossed the threshold, the door snapped shut behind her with a solid metallic click that echoed down the hallway. Cruz flinched. Matthews lowered his radio slowly, his face unreadable. The SWAT team didn't move. No one spoke. All eyes stayed locked on that door like it had just swallowed her whole. The lion's den had closed, and now she was in it alone. The air inside apartment 402 felt heavier than Danielle remembered. The door's metallic click still echoed in her ears as she stood just inside the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet, thick with stale air and something else, fear. To her left, in the far corner, 3 hostages huddled together, an older woman clutching a scarf to her mouth, a college-aged man sitting with his knees drawn to his chest, and a little girl gripping the man's sleeve. Her wide eyes locked on Danielle as if trying to decide if she was danger or salvation. Danielle didn't look directly at them. Not yet. Any sudden movement could set off Simon's nerves, and she knew better than to rush this. She turned her gaze toward the center of the room where Simon Brooks crouched low against the wall, his back pressed into the corner beneath a boarded-up window. He held a small black detonator in one hand, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles that spoke of nights without sleep. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, like he was choking on words he hadn't spoken in years. "It's really you," Simon whispered. His voice cracked like dry paper. Danielle took one step forward, slow and deliberate, raising her empty hands just enough to show she was unarmed. "I told you. I never left you." Simon let out a short, broken laugh that sounded more like a cough. "That's a lie," he hissed. "You left me in Beirut. You left me to burn." Danielle didn't flinch. She moved another step closer, scanning his body language, noting the twitch in his jaw, the shake in his fingers. He was wired tight, but not out of control. "Not yet. I didn't leave you, Simon," she said quietly. "They left both of us. They erased us because we were too dangerous to keep, too broken to fix." Simon's face twisted into something between rage and grief. "Don't you dare compare yourself to me. You had rank. You had power. You walked away. I begged them to let me stay. I begged them to let me find you. They told me you were dead." Danielle's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "And they told me you cracked under pressure. They told me you were a liability, a threat to national security. They buried us both. Simon, you in silence, me in shadows." Simon's eyes darted toward the hostages, then back to Danielle. "You know what they did after Beirut. They sent me home with a bottle of pills and a letter thanking me for my service. That's all I was worth to them." His voice broke on the last word. Danielle felt the weight of it hit her chest like a hammer. She knew that pain too well. "You were worth more than they ever admitted," she whispered. "And you still are." Simon let out another jagged breath, his grip on the detonator tightening. "They think I'm a monster. They're ready to kill me on live TV." Danielle took another step, closing the gap between them inch by inch. "You're not a monster, Simon. You're a ghost. You're what they made when they erased your name and locked the door behind you." Simon's jaw quivered. His eyes filled with something Danielle hadn't seen in years, doubt. He lowered the detonator slightly, just enough to let his arm shake freely. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he whispered, his voice cracking like a broken window pane. "I just wanted them to hear me, to see me, to know I didn't die back there." Danielle's breath caught. This was it, the heart of everything. He didn't want blood. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted to be seen. Danielle dared another step forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I see you, Simon. I've always seen you." His eyes locked on hers, wide and shaking. "Then tell me why no one else ever did." Danielle swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She lowered herself slowly to one knee, keeping her hands visible, her voice softer than ever. "Because they needed you to disappear. Because admitting they broke you meant admitting they broke all of us." Simon's breath hitched. His body sagged slightly against the wall like the weight of that truth had knocked the last bit of fight out of him. Danielle could see it now. He wasn't holding those hostages to kill them. He was holding them to make someone, anyone, finally stop and listen. And she was the only one who ever had. Danielle stayed perfectly still, one knee pressed against the dusty floor, breathing slow and steady. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to take the shot that wasn't there, to reach out and grab the detonator, but she knew that wasn't how this would end. She had trained Simon to sense intention long before someone made a move. If she flinched now, if she showed one crack of desperation, it would all fall apart. The three hostages in the corner barely breathed, their terrified eyes darting between her and Simon like they were balancing on a thread stretched thin enough to snap with a whisper. Simon's face was breaking apart in real time. The rigid anger he'd carried into this nightmare had thinned to something raw and fragile, like a man standing on the edge of himself. His knuckles trembled around the small black device in his hand. His lips quivered as if the words were stuck in his throat. Danielle's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you remember what I told you in Caracas?" The last thing I said before every mission. Simon didn't respond, but his eyes flicked toward hers, glassy and confused. Danielle leaned in slightly, her voice softer than breath. "Always leave yourself a way out." Simon's bottom lip shook, his grip tightening before loosening again like his body was fighting itself. Danielle pressed on, her tone steady, anchoring him to something deeper than the chaos in his mind. "You built this trap. You made them listen, But if you finish it this way, you lose the one thing they can never take from you." Simon's throat worked around the knot, choking him. "What's that?" he whispered. Danielle took one careful breath. "The right to choose how your story ends." Simon let out a ragged breath, the fight in his body faltering. His shoulders slumped, his head bowing like someone who had carried the weight of the world for far too long. A single tear broke free, sliding down the side of his face. His chest heaved once, twice, then collapsed into shallow, shaking breaths. "I didn't want to hurt them," he rasped, glancing toward the hostages. "I just wanted them to know I was still alive." Danielle took one more step forward, slowly raising her hand not to reach for him, not to take the device, but to show she wasn't afraid. "They see you, Simon, right now. Everyone does. Don't let them call you a terrorist. Don't let them erase you again." Simon's fingers twitched around the detonator, his entire body trembling like he was standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. Danielle could feel the air shift, like the entire room was holding its breath. Simon's shoulders shook once, then again, and then, with a broken gasp, he let the detonator slip from his hand. It hit the floor with a hollow thud, rolling slightly before coming to a stop between them. Danielle didn't move. She waited, watching Simon fall to his knees, his hands covering his face as silent sobs broke through his cracked composure. The hostages didn't move either. They sat frozen, still unsure if it was over. Danielle lowered herself fully to the ground, her body trembling from the release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding for hours. She reached towards Simon, not to grab him, but to place her hand palm up on the floor between them, giving him the choice to take it or not. Simon let out a shaky breath, lowering his hand slowly. His eyes met hers, hollow but not empty. He reached out, his hand closing over hers with the grip of a man drowning in his own silence. But just as the moment settled, something shifted in the air. Danielle felt it before she heard it, the faint vibration of boots on the roof above them. Her blood ran cold. She glanced toward the ceiling, barely moving her head, but she knew. Someone had ignored the hold. Someone had given the order anyway. Danielle's stomach twisted as she realized who. Carter. The weight of Simon's hand in Danielle's palm felt like the entire building had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. For a moment, there was nothing but quiet between them. The kind of quiet that didn't feel like fear anymore, but something closer to release. Danielle kept her body low, her voice steady as she whispered, "We walk out of here together. Simon, no one gets hurt. Not them. Not you." Simon nodded slowly, tears still streaking down his face. But then it happened. A faint vibration, so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, shivered through the floorboards above them. Danielle's heart dropped. She knew that rhythm, the staggered step of a rooftop breach team repositioning above their heads. She stiffened, her breath catching as she tilted her head ever so slightly toward the ceiling. No, not now. Not after all this. Simon noticed the shift in her posture instantly. His body tensed again, his eyes narrowing. "What's happening?" he whispered, panic tightening his throat. Danielle squeezed his hand hard. "Stay with me. It's not what you think. I've got this." She shifted her weight, sliding the detonator slowly away from him without breaking eye contact. But Simon was already pulling back, his breathing quickening. "They're coming, aren't they? You lied." Danielle's voice snapped like a whip, firm and sharp. "No one is coming through that door, I promise you." But even as she said it, the faint creak above them grew louder, more deliberate. On the rooftop, 2 SWAT officers in full gear crept toward the skylight. Their rifles were raised, movements precise as they prepared to drop down into apartment 402. Behind them, Carter stood near the breach coordinator, barking low orders into a secured comm channel, overriding Matthew's earlier stand-down. He watched the feed with a twisted satisfaction, convinced this was his redemption. Back on the ground, Cruz stood frozen near the command table, her face draining of color as she glanced at Matthews, who hadn't given that order. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. Matthews snapped his head toward the rooftop feed, horror spreading across his face. Who the hell gave that green light? Danielle heard it before they did the distinct shift of weight, the snap of a boot brushing metal. She knew the team was seconds from breaching. Her instinct screamed that there wasn't time to argue, wasn't time to explain. She lunged for the small radio strapped to the tactical vest of one of the hostages, who had been stripped of it earlier by Simon. She didn't hesitate. She clicked the transmit button and pushed her voice through the frequency with everything she had. Black Lamb, abort. Immediately explosives. The entire building seemed to freeze on the sound of those 5 words. In the command center, Matthews's jaw fell open, his face blanching as if the air had been ripped from the room. He knew that code. Everyone who had ever held federal clearance knew that code. Black Lamb wasn't a panic phrase. It wasn't just a tactical override. It was the highest-level emergency code used only in cases involving weapons of mass destruction or catastrophic loss of life. It was a code only issued by command-level operatives with national clearance. And Danielle Reed had just triggered it in front of them all. Cruz clamped a hand over her mouth, her heart pounding as the realization hit her. Matthews stood frozen, his radio slipping slightly in his grip as the reality of what Danielle had just done crashed down on him. He turned toward the rooftop operator, his voice breaking through the stunned silence. "Hold position. Stand down. Cancel all breach commands immediately." On the rooftop, the team leader flinched, glancing toward his comms officer. "Did you copy that Black Lamb?" The officer nodded, eyes wide. "Full abort. Cease movement now." Carter, hearing the same command, turned bright red, his mouth falling open in disbelief. "No, you don't get to call that." He snapped, lunging toward the rooftop coordinator. "Continue the breach. That's not a real." But the coordinator stepped back, shaking his head. "That's a confirmed federal code. Lieutenant, you're not in charge anymore." Carter's fists clenched at his sides, his face contorting with rage as he watched his entire operation crumble in front of him. Down in the apartment, Danielle stayed locked in place, still gripping the radio, still holding Simon's gaze. Simon stared at her, wide-eyed and trembling, trying to process what she had just done. Danielle leaned in, her voice cracking through the heavy silence. "I told you. Simon, I didn't come here to trick you. I came to stop them." And in that moment, as the rooftop team froze above them, as Matthews stood frozen in shock, as Carter's authority disintegrated before his eyes, the entire system did exactly what Danielle commanded. It stopped. In the mobile command post, silence weighed heavier than steel. Cruz stood frozen, staring at the radio like it had just turned into a bomb. Matthews didn't move for several long seconds, his jaw locked so tight the muscle twitched in his cheek. Every technician, every SWAT operator, every ranking officer present had heard the same 5 words, and they all knew what they meant. Matthews finally broke the silence, his voice razor sharp. "Confirm the Black Lamb code. Full validation now." The lead technician's hands trembled as he typed into the secure database, bypassing all standard clearance levels. The entire team leaned in, eyes locked on the screen as the query processed. Carter stood off to the side, pacing like a caged animal, his face burning red with fury and disbelief. "It's fake," he hissed under his breath. "It has to be fake. She can't call that. She doesn't have clearance." But then the screen flashed green. The technician turned, his face pale. "Code Black Lamb confirmed. Valid authorization. User MR0019 Delta Alpha class, Matthews staggered back half a step, blinking as if the ground had tilted beneath him. His voice came out hoarse. Danielle Reed is cleared for Black Lamb. The room erupted, not in noise, but in stunned, breathless shock. No one spoke, no one moved. Even Carter stopped pacing, his face contorting as if someone had punched the air from his lungs. Matthews turned toward him slowly, his eyes colder than Carter had ever seen. "She's one of 23 people in this country authorized to use that code," Matthews said, his voice low and deadly, "and you tried to override her." Carter's mouth opened, but no words came out. Matthews didn't wait for an excuse. He pointed to the nearest officer. "Get him out of here. Now." 2 officers moved instantly, grabbing Carter by the arms before he could protest. He struggled for a heartbeat, his face twisted in disbelief. "You're making a mistake. She's bluffing. This whole thing as a Matthews didn't even turn his head. Escort him off this site. He's done." Carter's voice cracked as he was dragged away, his boots scraping against the asphalt. No one watched him leave. No one cared. Every pair of eyes stayed locked on the screen, on the confirmed code, on the reality they had never expected to face. On the rooftop, the breach team froze in place, their commander relaying the hold with shaking hands. Black Lamb confirmed. Full abort. Do not move. Repeat. Do not move. The SWAT officers exchanged looks, confusion and shame passing silently between them. They had mocked Danielle. They had doubted her, and now they stood frozen by 5 words none of them had ever imagined hearing from her. Inside apartment 402, Danielle watched the tension drain from Simon's body as the ceiling above them fell silent again. She could feel the air shifting, the danger pulling back like a tide. Simon's shoulders collapsed as he dropped his head into his hands. Danielle stayed low, keeping her voice steady. "They're standing down. Simon, it's over if you let it be over." Simon didn't speak. His breath came in short, uneven bursts. Danielle inched closer, never once reaching for the detonator still resting on the floor. "I need you to trust me again. We can end this right now, but I need to make this place safe." Simon let out a broken breath, but didn't stop her. Danielle moved slowly, scanning the apartment with the practiced eyes of someone who had trained men like Simon to build these traps. She spotted the first device hidden in the corner, wired to the window frame with a thin copper line. She kept her voice calm, explaining every movement as she approached. "I'm going to cut the first wire. Stay with me." Simon nodded weakly, still slumped on the floor. Danielle reached into her jacket, pulling out a small blade hidden in the seam. With one precise motion, she sliced through the wire, disabling the first trigger. 1 down, 2 to go. Outside, the SWAT team, the command post, the technicians, everyone held their breath, waiting to see if she could really shut it all down. Danielle didn't hesitate. She was already moving toward the bathroom, where she had seen the faint shimmer of fishing line stretched across the doorframe. She was the only one who could dismantle what she had once taught Simon to build, and she wasn't stopping until every last piece was dead in her hands. Danielle crouched low near the bathroom door, eyes locked on the nearly invisible fishing line stretched tight across the frame. One wrong move and the entire device would blow. Simon watched her from the floor, trembling, his breath catching with every inch she moved. Danielle didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly where he was, how scared he was, and how close they both stood to losing everything. Her fingers moved with surgical precision as she reached into her boot and pulled out a compact wire cutter. Slowly, she traced the line back to the crude detonator hidden behind a loose tile in the wall. Her heart pounded, but her hands never shook. With one clean snap, she severed the line. The second device was neutralized. She exhaled through her nose, keeping her breathing steady as she turned back toward the living room. The third signal had come from the ventilation duct above the entryway. She could see the faint outline of the modified canister wedged into the metal grate. She moved toward it without hesitation, ignoring the sweat dripping down the side of her face. Simon whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "I'm sorry." Danielle didn't answer. Not yet. She reached up, balancing on the edge of a broken chair, prying the grate loose with her blade. The device dropped into her hands, the weight of it heavier than it looked. Carefully, she flipped it over, locating the battery pack taped to the side. One precise twist, and the power went dead. All three devices were disarmed. Danielle dropped to her knees, placing all three components on the floor where Simon could see them. She turned to face him fully, her voice soft but unshakable. "It's done. No more traps. No more running." Simon buried his face in his hands, collapsing forward with a sound that cracked the air like glass breaking. Danielle reached out, placing a steady hand on his back. "We walk out of here together, Simon, you and me. That's the only way this ends." Beside the command post, Cruz stood locked in place, her hand covering her mouth as she watched the surveillance monitors. The feed was limited, but the audio still carried Danielle's voice, steady and clear. Matthews leaned in, his voice rough. "Tell me she did it." The lead technician nodded slowly. "All three signals are down. The apartment is clean." Matthews let out a long breath, rubbing his face with both hands. Cruz turned to him, her voice thick with emotion. "She just shut down the whole thing, sir, alone, without firing a single shot." Carter, standing just inside the barricade with two officers flanking him, scoffed in disbelief. "This is a joke. You're all letting her run this. It's her damn operation. You're gonna tell me you actually believe she's the only one who could have pulled this off?" Matthews turned toward him slowly, the weight of the last hour pressing into every inch of his posture. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You're done, Carter." Effective immediately, Carter's face contorted with rage. "You can't do that. You don't have the authority." Matthews stepped forward until they were almost nose to nose. "I just did. You're suspended. You've endangered lives, disobeyed a direct order, and tried to undermine federal clearance." He nodded to the officers beside Carter. "Escort him off the site. Strip his comms. Remove his access to all channels." Carter's face twisted, but this time he didn't fight. He knew it was over. The officers gripped his arms and walked him out of the command post. The team watched in silence as the man who had tried to silence Danielle again and again was finally shut down himself. Matthews turned back toward the monitors, his jaw tightening. He leaned toward Cruz. "Get ready. She's bringing them out." Danielle stood at the center of apartment 402, her breath steady as she slowly rose to her feet. The three hostages huddled together in the corner, still frozen in place, their wide eyes flicking between her and Simon as if waiting for something to snap. Danielle turned to them, her voice low but firm. "It's over. You're going to stand up slowly and follow me. Do you understand?" The older woman nodded first, clutching the little girl tighter as she helped her to her feet. The young man rose next, shaky but unharmed. Danielle turned to Simon, extending her hand again, not as a captor, not as a threat, but as the only bridge he had left to something that might still resemble redemption. "Let's go," she whispered. Simon's shoulders slumped as he nodded, standing with the kind of slow, broken surrender that wasn't forced but chosen. He raised his empty hands in front of him, glancing at the hostages, silently acknowledging the weight of what he'd done. Danielle moved first, stepping into the hallway with careful, deliberate strides. She kept her hands visible, palms open, signaling to the snipers and officers still watching through scopes that no one inside posed a threat. The hostages followed closely behind her, clinging to each other, their eyes darting nervously as they moved. Simon walked last, his hands still raised, his head bowed. Danielle didn't look back, but she knew every camera in the building was capturing every step they took. They moved down the hallway toward the stairwell, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Cruz watched from the command post, her fists clenched at her sides, barely breathing. Matthews stood beside her, leaning toward the monitors, his voice tight. "Come on, Danielle. Bring them out." The camera feed flickered as Danielle reached the stairwell door. She paused for half a second, listening. No movement, no sudden threats. She pushed the door open and led the group down the stairs, outside the building. A dense crowd had gathered behind the police barricades. Bystanders held up their phones, live streaming every second. News crews fought for position, their cameras already rolling. The footage had already started spreading online, first the clips of Danielle being mocked and slammed to the ground, then the reports of her taking over the entire operation. People who had no idea who she was an hour ago now hung on every second, every breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The front entrance of Silver Ridge creaked open. Danielle emerged first, hands raised, her face unreadable. Behind her, the hostages stepped into the light, alive, untouched, wide-eyed but safe. And then came Simon, head down, hands still raised, walking like a man who had finally stopped running. The SWAT team stood frozen on the perimeter, weapons lowered, helmets off, not a single one daring to move. Not one word was spoken. Cruz and Matthews pushed through the line of officers, stopping just short of the barricade. The crowd held its collective breath as Danielle guided the group toward the waiting paramedics. She didn't stop walking until every hostage was in the care of medical staff. Only then did she turn back to Simon. He stood in front of her, shaking, his throat working around a silent apology that would never come out. Danielle nodded once, slow and deliberate. Simon lowered to his knees on the pavement, placing his hands behind his head in surrender. SWAT officers approached carefully, cuffing him without resistance. Danielle stood over him for a moment longer, her breath heavy, her fists unclenching for the first time in hours. She turned toward the crowd. Cameras zoomed in, phones lifted higher, but no one shouted, no one cheered. The entire street stood silent, as if they all knew they had just witnessed something far bigger than anyone could explain. The black woman they had watched get humiliated, mocked, and dismissed had just let everyone out alive. Cruz moved first, pushing through the officers, her eyes shining with something between awe and disbelief. Matthews followed, his face unreadable as he watched Danielle stand alone in the middle of the street, the weight of everything she had carried now visible in every inch of her body. The moment hung in the air like a held breath, and then, just like that, the world watching from their screens erupted. It started before Danielle even made it back behind the barricades. Somewhere in that silent crowd, someone hit the share button, then another, then 100 more. Within minutes, the first clip to go viral wasn't the hostage rescue. It was the moment hours earlier when Danielle had been forced to the ground by Carter in full view of civilians filming with shaking hands and angry voices whispering under their breath. The footage captured Carter's mocking tone, the way he pressed her face to the asphalt, and the way his team had laughed like it was entertainment. The captions hit hard. Black woman humiliated by police seconds before saving their lives. Hashtags exploded. Danielle Reed, she warned them. Black Lamb Code. Celebrities reposted it. Activists picked it up. News outlets scrambled to get ahead of it, cutting together packages that started with the assault and ended with Danielle leading the hostages out alive while the SWAT team stood frozen, silenced not by orders, but by the weight of what they had witnessed. Every angle was covered. The rooftop footage showed the SWAT team halting mid-breach. The command post audio leaked, confirming Danielle's black lamb order. Even body cam footage surfaced Carter's smug face frozen in high definition as he dismissed her, mocked her, tried to erase her in front of his team. It was undeniable, and it wasn't just national, it went global. Within hours, Danielle's name was trending across every platform, but while the internet raged and celebrated, back inside the Los Angeles Police Department, the mood was anything but triumphant. Carter sat stone-faced in a small, windowless disciplinary hearing room. A panel of senior officers, internal affairs investigators, and legal counsel sat across from him. On the table in front of them was a thick stack of printed reports, stills from the footage, and a transcript of the confirmed radio logs. Captain Matthews stood in the back of the room, arms crossed, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any witness could. Carter tried to keep his face neutral, but the sweat on his neck betrayed him. He had no defense left. The panel chair leaned forward, her voice clipped and cold. "Lieutenant Carter, you are being charged with abuse of authority, racial misconduct, insubordination, and endangering the lives of civilians and law enforcement personnel." She slid the report across the table toward him. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of all command duties. Your badge is suspended pending final termination review. You will vacate your post by end of day." Carter's jaw twitched. He opened his mouth to argue, but the panel chair cut him off before he could speak. "We have a nation watching, Lieutenant, and they've already seen what we've failed to stop." Matthews finally stepped forward, his voice low and final. "It's over, Carter." Carter's fists clenched in his lap, but he didn't speak again. There was nothing left to say. As he was escorted from the room, the panel chair turned to Matthews. Has Commander Reed responded to the department's request for debrief? Matthews shook his head once. "No, but she won't be taking that meeting." The chair arched a brow. "And why is that?" Matthews let out a breath. "Because the NSA already called her in." By the next morning, while the city was still burning through every frame of the viral footage, Danielle received the message. It wasn't a formal invitation. It was a direct order. A black SUV waited outside her building before sunrise. No press, no fanfare, no cameras, just a single sentence on the official envelope tucked under her door. "We need to talk." Danielle stood alone in a cold, windowless conference room somewhere deep inside a secure NSA building in Washington, D.C. The walls were bare concrete. The air smelled of recycled ventilation and old government silence. No one had told her where she was exactly. But she didn't need to ask. She had stood in rooms like this before, rooms that existed off the books, where decisions were made long before the public ever heard about them. Across the table sat 3 people, each more unreadable than the next. The director of the NSA, a man with the kind of polished stillness that made your skin itch, a representative from the Pentagon, his hands clasped so tightly on the table it looked like his fingers might snap, and a woman from the Department of Veterans Affairs, her tired eyes darting from her tablet to Danielle's face like she was trying to measure the cost of what they were about to ask. No one spoke for a long moment. Danielle leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. The NSA director finally broke the silence. "You embarrassed a lot of people this week." His voice was low, calculated. Danielle didn't blink. "I did what none of you were willing to do." The Pentagon representative shifted uncomfortably, but the NSA director kept his expression flat. "We don't disagree. That's why you're here." The VA official leaned forward, clearing her throat. "You exposed a gap in our system. one we can no longer afford to ignore. She slid a file across the table toward Danielle. It was thin, but the seal on the cover told her it was already cleared for execution. We're proposing a national program to identify, rehabilitate, and reintegrate veterans like Simon Brooks before they fall through the cracks. Danielle didn't touch the file. You want me to put my name on your damage control project? The VA official flinched. But the NSA director didn't. We want you to build it, design it, run it. Danielle leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Under whose authority the Pentagon rep finally spoke, his voice clipped and cautious. Yours, if you accept. Danielle let the offer hang in the air for a moment before she leaned back again, exhaling through her nose. What's the catch? The NSA director steepled his fingers. We control the budget. We approve the public narrative. We retain final oversight. Danielle let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. No, if you want me, you give me full operational control, independent oversight, real funding, and you make it permanent. No task force, no PR stunt, a real program with real teeth. Otherwise, you can spin this however you want. But I won't be a part of another lie. The three officials exchanged glances. The NSA director leaned back, studying her for a long moment. You're asking for more than we planned to give. Danielle stood slowly, placing her hands on the table, her voice low and final. You're asking me to clean up your mess. You don't get to set the terms. Another long silence stretched across the room. Finally, the VA official nodded slowly. We'll draft the new charter. The NSA director's jaw tightened, but he nodded as well. You'll have full control. Independent review. National reach. Danielle didn't move for a heartbeat longer, measuring the weight of what she had just forced them to admit. Then she leaned down, tapped the file with one finger, and walked toward the door without another word. 3 months later, the Tempest program was officially announced not as a pilot, not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent national initiative written into federal law. The building didn't look like much from the outside. It stood quietly on the outskirts of Baltimore, tucked between a community health clinic and an aging parking structure. There were no signs, no grand entrances, no reporters camped outside, but inside, the Tempest Veterans Recovery and Reintegration Initiative had already begun. Danielle stepped through the glass doors for the first time since the program had officially launched. The staff inside greeted her not with fanfare, but with quiet nods of recognition, the kind of respect that didn't need cameras to validate it. She didn't come to check on operations or to give a speech. She came for one reason. Simon Brooks had been admitted 2 weeks earlier, not as a criminal, not in handcuffs, but as the program's first official candidate. No cameras had captured his transfer, no headlines had announced it, but for Danielle, this was the only headline that mattered. She walked down the sterile hallway toward the private recovery wing, passing rooms filled with veterans and quiet therapy sessions, peer groups, and one-on-one counseling. This was what she had demanded in that cold NSA room. Not a press release, not a task force. Real work, real healing. A program that didn't treat soldiers like broken equipment to be discarded. She stopped in front of room 14, her hand hovering over the handle for a brief moment before she pushed the door open. Simon stood by the window, staring out at the small courtyard below where other veterans sat beneath a wide oak tree. His posture was stiff but no longer haunted by the weight of explosives or fear. He heard the door open but didn't turn right away. Danielle stood in the doorway, unsure of what to say first. But then Simon slowly turned, his eyes meeting hers, and without hesitation, he stood tall and raised his hand in a crisp military salute. There was no anger in his face, no bitterness, just the steady, grounded look of a soldier acknowledging not the commander he once blamed, but the mentor who had never truly left him. Danielle swallowed hard, her throat tight. She returned the salute with the quiet dignity of someone who knew what this moment meant, not just for him, but for herself. Simon lowered his hand slowly, breaking the silence. "They told me you'd come." Danielle nodded, stepping further into the room, "Not to check on you, to remind you that this time you finished the mission." Simon let out a shaky breath, but it wasn't the breath of a man breaking down. It was the breath of someone holding on to something real for the first time in years. The team of PTSD specialists stood quietly outside the glass window, watching the two of them not as patient and administrator, but as two survivors finding their way back from a war no one had ever officially acknowledged. Later that week, Los Angeles announced the launch of the protocol wisdom, integrity, tactical awareness, empathy, a mandatory officer training program inspired by the very woman they once humiliated on live television. Danielle didn't show up for the press conference. She didn't need to. The program wasn't about her name. It was about making sure what happened in Silver Ridge never happened again. The lecture hall inside the Los Angeles Police Academy was silent. No chairs scraped against the floor. No one whispered under their breath. 40 recruits sat perfectly still, eyes locked forward. At the front of the room, written in clean black letters on a whiteboard, were the 4 words that had already begun reshaping police training across the state: wisdom, integrity, tactics, empathy, a protocol. This was the first official session of the program that had grown out of the fallout at Silver Ridge. Every officer in this room had seen the footage. They had heard the news reports. Some had even shared the viral clips themselves, adding their voices to the wave of public outrage. But none of them had expected the woman from that video to stand in front of them in person. Danielle Reed didn't introduce herself with rank or reputation. She didn't mention Black Lamb. She didn't reference Simon Brooks. She didn't even bring up the viral moment that had made her name known around the country. She stood in front of the recruits with her sleeves rolled up, a plain notebook in her hand, and a marker resting on the podium beside her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and unsettlingly direct. "What's the first thing you notice when you walk into a room?" A few recruits shifted in their seats. No one answered. Danielle scanned the room slowly, letting the question hang like a stone in the air. "Most of you have been taught to scan for threats, to check hands, to watch body language, to assess posture. That's good training, but that's not enough." She paced slowly in front of the whiteboard, her boots echoing just slightly on the tile floor. "You've been trained to read tactics, but you've never been taught to read people." She paused, turning to face the room again. "If you walk into a space and it smells like bleach, what do you think?" One recruit near the back raised a cautious hand. "Someone's cleaning another recruit." Boulder added, "Or someone's hiding something." Danielle nodded slowly. "And which answer is correct?" The room stayed quiet. Danielle leaned on the edge of the podium, folding her arms. "The answer isn't the point. The point is whether you bother to ask the question in the first place." The recruits exchanged quiet glances, shifting again in their seats. Danielle let them sit with the discomfort for a long moment before continuing. "This program isn't here to make you faster or tougher. It's here to make you pay attention to people, to spaces, to yourself, because the first mistake you'll make out there is assuming you already know what you're looking at." She placed the marker back on the podium, closing her notebook without writing a single word on the board. "That's all for today." No one moved right away. They seemed unsure if the lesson was really over. But Danielle stepped away from the front of the room, walking toward the back with the same steady pace she had carried since the moment she walked in. Cruz, leaning by the doorway with her arms crossed, gave Danielle a slight nod of approval as she passed. Danielle didn't return it. She was already halfway to the exit when the door at the far end of the hall creaked open. A figure stepped inside quietly, almost as if unsure whether they belonged. Danielle stopped mid-step, her breath catching for the first time that day. It wasn't a recruit. It wasn't an officer. It was someone she never expected to see again. Danielle stood frozen near the exit, her eyes narrowing as the figure stepped inside. No uniform, no badge, just a plain gray shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a pair of worn jeans. Brian Carter. His face looked different now. The sharp arrogance that had once carried him like armor was gone. His shoulders hung lower, his jaw clenched not in defiance, but in something that looked a lot like shame. The recruits hadn't noticed him yet. They were too busy gathering their things, standing in small clusters, whispering about the lesson they had just heard. But Danielle didn't move. She watched as Carter made his way slowly down the aisle, never raising his head to meet her stare. He didn't speak. He didn't try to explain himself. He walked to the last row, the farthest corner, and sat down alone. His hands stayed on the desk in front of him, empty and still. Cruz noticed the shift in Danielle's posture from across the room. She followed Danielle's line of sight and froze when she spotted Carter sitting in the back. Her jaw tightened, but she stayed silent, waiting to see what Danielle would do. Danielle took a slow breath, then turned back toward the front of the room. The recruits were nearly gone now, filing out one by one, their conversations low but excited. None of them seemed to recognize the man who had once stood at the center of the scandal they had all watched unfold. Danielle waited until the last recruit disappeared through the door before she crossed back to the front. Carter stayed seated, unmoving. She leaned against the table, arms crossed, watching him. The silence stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of confrontation. Finally, Carter looked up, not defiant, not defensive, just exhausted. "I heard about the program," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I want to learn, for real this time." Danielle didn't answer right away. She studied him, searching for the lie, the performance, the last trace of the man who had pinned her to the ground and laughed. But she didn't see that man anymore. She didn't see anything but someone who had lost more than he ever expected. Carter swallowed hard, shifting in his seat. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I can't walk away from this without trying to be better than I was." Danielle let out a slow breath, her jaw tightening. She pushed off the table and took a step toward him, stopping just a few feet away. Her voice stayed low, steady. "Observation begins when you discard your biases." Carter nodded once, his eyes dropping to the desk. Danielle didn't say anything else. She turned and walked toward the door, leaving him sitting alone in the empty classroom. Cruz watched from the hallway, her brow furrowed. Danielle met her eyes, giving a small shake of her head, not in anger, not in dismissal, but in quiet acknowledgement that some lessons had to be learned the hard way. Carter stayed in that seat until the lights dimmed, until the hallways emptied, till the silence wrapped around him like a punishment he knew he deserved. And, for the first time in his career, he didn't interrupt, didn't defend, didn't make excuses. He just listened, every word, every moment, without missing a thing. The room felt different on the final day. There were no murmurs, no restless shifting in chairs, no side conversations. The young recruits who had filled this space week after week with curiosity, uncertainty, and sometimes silent skepticism now sat motionless, waiting. Every seat was filled, and every eye was on her. Danielle Reed stood once again at the front of the protocol classroom, but there was no need to command their attention. They had already given it to her, not because of her rank, not because of her reputation, but because by now they understood she wasn't here to give them what they expected. She was here to give them what no one else dared to teach. She glanced down at the closed notebook on the podium beside her. It had remained unopened the entire course. No prepared speeches, no printed handouts, just observation, engagement, and the kind of uncomfortable truth that made people question everything they thought they knew. Danielle looked up and let her gaze sweep across the room. 40 recruits, 40 futures, and sitting quietly in the back row, as he had since the day he returned, was Brian Carter. He hadn't missed a single session. He never spoke. He never took notes. He never argued. He just sat there, silent, as if trying to reconcile the man he used to be with the man he now knew he had to become. Danielle let the silence hold a little longer before she finally spoke. "You came here thinking this course would make you better at controlling situations," she began, her voice steady but soft enough to make them lean in. "You expected tactics, procedures, maybe even a few psychological tricks to give you an advantage out there." She paused, letting the truth settle before continuing. "What you didn't expect was that the hardest thing I'd ask you to do is listen." She stepped out from behind the podium and began pacing slowly in front of the whiteboard. Listening sounds simple, but in this job, it is the most dangerous skill you'll ever fail to develop. Because when you stop listening, you stop seeing people as people. You start seeing them as problems to fix, threats to neutralize, obstacles to overcome, and that's when you make mistakes you can never take back. The recruits sat rigid, absorbing every word. Danielle stopped in the center of the room and turned to face them fully. "I've watched men with more experience than you will ever have lose everything because they thought carrying a gun made them powerful. I've watched officers hide behind procedure while ignoring the people standing right in front of them. And I've watched entire systems fall apart because no one had the courage to hear the things no one wanted to admit." Her voice lowered, sharper now. "You're not here to enforce power. You're here to hold space for truth. And the truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's in the way someone flinches when you enter a room. Sometimes it's in the silence between their words. Sometimes it's in what they don't say at all. And if you can't learn to hear that, you have no business wearing this badge." She let the weight of that statement hang in the air as she slowly walked toward the back of the room, stopping just a few feet from Carter. He didn't move. He didn't lower his eyes. He just watched her, waiting. Danielle studied him for a long moment, remembering the first time she had seen him brash, dismissive, arrogant, the man who had pinned her to the ground in front of the cameras, convinced she had nothing to offer. And yet, here he was, the only one who had stayed silent the entire time. The only one who hadn't tried to impress or explain or justify, the man who had come back, not to be seen, but to learn. Danielle turned back to the rest of the room. "You've spent weeks learning what most officers go their entire careers without ever being taught. You've been forced to confront your own biases, to question your assumptions, to sit in the discomfort of not having all the answers. That's the real training. That's the lesson you carry out of here." She walked back to the front, resting her hands on the edge of the podium. "You'll leave this room, and you'll face a world that doesn't care how well you scored on your final exam. You'll face people who don't trust you, and in some cases, they'll be right not to. Because trust isn't something you wear, it's something you prove. Every single day." She paused, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Real strength isn't in your voice. It's in your silence. It's in the moment you choose to listen when every part of you wants to speak. It's in the breath you take before you react. It's in the way you show up, not as a weapon, but as a witness to the truth standing right in front of you." The recruits didn't move. They didn't breathe. Danielle looked down at the closed notebook one last time, then pushed it aside. That's all I have for you." She stepped away from the podium and headed toward the door. One by one, the recruits stood, gathering their things in complete silence. No one rushed. No one whispered. They moved as if they understood they were walking out of more than just a classroom. They were walking out of the old way of thinking. Carter remained seated until every recruit had filed out. Danielle stopped by the door, glancing back at him. He finally stood, not in defiance, not seeking validation, but in quiet acknowledgement that the hardest work was only just beginning. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Danielle gave him one slow nod, just enough to say she had seen him make it this far. Then she turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind her. As the recruits exited the building, they all paused at the same spot just outside the door. Mounted on the wall, in simple engraved metal, was the quote Danielle had refused to let them turn into a slogan. The recruits stood in front of it, some reaching out to touch the words, others reading them silently as if committing them to memory. The plaque read, "Respect is not a rank. It comes from action, no cameras, no speeches, no applause, just a hallway filled with recruits who now understood that this wasn't the end of their training. It was the beginning of a responsibility none of them could afford to forget. Carter was the last to step through the door. He stood in front of the plaque longer than anyone else. His eyes scanned the words, not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who finally knew why those words had always been more than just a lesson. They were a promise, a standard, and for the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to earn them. The recruits filed out of Wilson Hall in near silence, their boots echoing softly against the polished concrete floor, as if even sound itself had learned to be quiet in this space. Outside the classroom door, sunlight slanted across the hallway, catching the brushed metal of the plaque mounted on the wall just beyond the exit. One by one, the recruits stopped. None of them had spoken since Danielle's final words. There was no chatter, no nervous laughter, no attempts to shake off the weight of what they had just learned. Instead, they stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the plaque as if it had more to say than any of them ever could. Etched in clean, bold lettering were the words that had shaped the course, the ones Danielle had refused to let become a marketing slogan or a soundbite for public relations. The words stood alone, unpolished and unapologetic. Respect is not a rank. It comes from action. No credits, no signature, no department logo, just a truth so simple it silenced even the proudest among them. Some recruits stood with their hands folded in front of them. Others shifted their weight uncomfortably, as if the plaque itself was holding them accountable in ways no instructor ever had. A few reached out to touch the metal, their fingers brushing the cool surface like it carried the weight of every mistake they had ever made or witnessed. Cruz stood near the back of the group, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, observing. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush them. She knew exactly what they were feeling because she had felt it herself the first time she read those words. It wasn't admiration, it wasn't inspiration, it was responsibility. And once you read them, you couldn't unsee them. Danielle stood a few paces back, watching quietly. She had seen the same reaction in every group that had passed through the protocol since its launch. The weight of the words never changed. What did change, what always changed, was the way people carried themselves after reading them. This wasn't about how they entered the room. It was about how they walked out of it. Carter stood at the edge of the group, farther back than the others. He didn't move to the front. He didn't push closer. He stood still, his jaw clenched, his hands loose at his sides. He stared at the plaque longer than anyone else, as if trying to measure himself against every letter carved into that wall. Danielle watched him but didn't approach. This moment wasn't hers to own. It was theirs to face, and his to accept. One of the younger recruits broke the silence first, turning to Cruz with a hesitant glance. "Are we dismissed?" Ma'am Cruz nodded once, pushing off the door frame. "You're dismissed. Remember what you learned here, out there. No one cares what this plaque says. They'll only care how you act when no one's watching." The recruits nodded in quiet agreement, filing down the hallway in small clusters, their footsteps gradually fading as they disappeared around the corner. Cruz turned toward Danielle, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she gave the smallest of smirks. "Another class down. You ever get tired of watching them stare at that thing like it's going to change their lives?" Danielle tilted her head slightly. "It's not the words on the wall that matter. It's whether they're still thinking about them 6 months from now when no one's there to remind them." Cruz let out a quiet breath, nodding, and Carter Danielle glanced toward the hallway where Carter still stood alone, facing the plaque. "He heard it," she said simply. Cruz arched a brow. "Is that enough?" Danielle didn't answer right away. She reached down, grabbed her bag from the floor, and slung it over her shoulder. "It's where I started." Carter finally turned toward them, but he didn't step closer. He stood his ground, his eyes flicking between Cruz and Danielle. For a moment, it looked like he might say something, but the words never came. Instead, he gave one small nod of acknowledgement, nothing more. Nothing less, then turned and walked down the hallway in the opposite direction of the recruits, disappearing without another glance back. Cruz watched him go, then turned to Danielle. "You think he'll ever really change?" Danielle exhaled through her nose, adjusting the strap of her bag. "That's not my decision to make." She turned toward the door, her voice steady as she walked away, but at least now he knows where to start. They stepped out into the sunlight, leaving behind the empty hallway, the silent plaque, and the weight of another chapter closed. To the world outside, it looked like just another day at the academy. But for the people who had stood in that hallway, whether they realized it or not, nothing about the way they carried their badge, their authority, or their responsibility would ever be the same again. And that was the point. Some legacies didn't need medals or titles or public recognition. Some legacies lived in the quiet spaces, on the walls no one talked about. In the moments no one filmed, they lived in the people who carried them forward without needing to be told twice. Danielle Reed didn't walk out of Wilson Hall as a hero. She walked out as what she had always been, a reminder that respect was never given. It was proven. And for those who understood that, it was a lesson that would never fade. The next morning, Danielle would return again. Bag slung over her shoulder, notebook unopened as always. The class would fill again, new faces, new doubts, new egos waiting to be unraveled. And she would start again, not with tactics, not with lectures, but with the same uncomfortable question they never expected to hear. "What's the first thing you notice when you walk into a room?" The sun hung low over the Los Angeles Police Academy, casting long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot. Most of the recruits had already gone, their cars pulling out one by one until the yard was almost silent. Danielle Reed moved across the cracked asphalt with her usual steady pace, the weight of her bag resting comfortably against her shoulder. She had walked this lot 100 times before, always alone, always in silence. It felt like the only place left where the noise couldn't touch her. No press, no eyes watching, no legacy to carry on her back, just the sound of her boots against concrete and the hum of the city fading into the distance. She reached her car, keys already in hand, when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn, not yet. She recognized hesitation when she heard it, the pattern of someone trying to decide if they had the right to speak. Danielle paused by the driver's side door, waiting, giving them the space to gather whatever courage they thought they needed. The footsteps grew closer, quickening slightly as whoever it was finally made up their mind. Danielle turned slowly, one eyebrow raised, ready to end the conversation before it started, If this was someone looking for approval she wasn't about to hand out. But it wasn't just anyone. It was the youngest recruit from the class. The one who had barely spoken all semester. The one who had never raised their hand until the final week when they had finally started asking the right questions, the questions no one wanted to hear. The recruit stopped a few feet away, their breath catching like they had just run a mile, even though they had barely crossed the lot. Danielle didn't speak. She just waited, letting the silence do what it always did, make them work for it. The recruit swallowed hard, shifting on their feet. "Commander, can I ask you something?" Danielle gave the slightest nod. "Speak." The recruit glanced down, then back up, their voice cracking just a little around the edges. "Do you ever regret it? Staying silent for 20 years? Do you wish you had spoken up sooner?" Danielle stood still, her keys dangling from her fingers, her face unreadable. She didn't answer right away. The recruit's shoulders tensed, like they were already bracing for a lecture or a dismissal, but none came. Instead, Danielle exhaled slowly, the faintest curl of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile of amusement, not even pride. Something quieter, something heavier. She took a step closer, her voice low but clear enough to stop the air between them. "If I had spoken sooner," she said, her words deliberate, "they would have called me a hero. They would have written headlines, shaken my hand, given me a plaque to hang on some wall." She paused, letting the weight of that settle before she finished. "But because I stayed silent, when I finally spoke, the entire system had to stop and listen." The recruit didn't move. They didn't speak. Danielle watched them process the answer, watched their throat tighten like they were trying to swallow something that didn't go down easy. Good. It wasn't supposed to. She leaned back slightly, her voice softening but never losing its edge. "Silence isn't weakness. It's what gives your voice the power to matter when it counts." The recruit let out a slow breath, nodding as if the air had finally returned to their lungs. Danielle turned back to her car, unlocking the door without another word. But before she climbed in, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. "Just make sure you know when to break it." The recruit stood frozen in place, staring after her as she slid into the driver's seat and closed the door with a quiet click. Danielle started the engine, the low rumble cutting through the stillness of the lot. She didn't look back as she pulled out onto the road, the sun casting long beams of gold across her windshield. She knew the question would stick with that recruit longer than any lesson she had taught. And that was the point. She wasn't here to give them easy answers. She was here to leave them with the questions they couldn't ignore. As she drove away, the words hung in the air behind her like an echo only the brave would dare to chase. From the quiet hilltops overlooking Los Angeles, the city stretched wide beneath a golden evening sky. The skyline stood unchanged, the traffic still hummed. The towers of steel and glass reflected the same sunlight they always had. From a distance, it looked like nothing had shifted at all. But those who had lived through the events of Silver Ridge knew the truth. Change doesn't arrive with fireworks or headlines. It arrives in silence, in the way people start carrying themselves differently, in the questions they start asking when no one else is watching. And across this city, that quiet shift had already begun. The news cycle had long since moved on. The footage of Danielle Reed standing in the street outside Silver Ridge had faded from the trending lists. The media had squeezed every headline they could from the story months ago, then buried it under newer, shinier scandals. No statues had been built, no awards had been handed out, no official ceremonies had been held in her honor. But inside the walls of every police precinct where the protocol was now standard, recruits whispered her name with a mixture of caution and respect. They didn't recite it as hero worship. They spoke it as a warning, a reminder that leadership had nothing to do with who held the loudest voice or the highest rank. It had everything to do with action. At the Tempest Veteran Recovery and Reintegration Center, Danielle stood in the observation room, watching through a one-way glass window as a group of veterans, some barely 30, others nearing 60, sat in a circle, speaking quietly with their counselors. There were no cameras here, no reporters, just people trying to find their way back from the edges of a system that had nearly forgotten them. Danielle folded her arms across her chest, her face unreadable. She knew the battle wasn't over. It never would be. But every session held here, every life pulled back from the margins, was another step in the right direction. In a small Montana town, far from the headlines, Brian Carter sat behind a desk in a low-ceilinged office labeled Personnel Records Division. He no longer carried a badge. He no longer wore a uniform. The walls were bare. The desk cluttered with paperwork no one outside this building would ever see. He didn't lead teams anymore. He didn't give orders. His job now was to archive the careers of others' quiet work, invisible work. But Carter knew better than anyone that sometimes the most important work isn't the kind anyone notices. And every time his hand hovered over a file marked conduct warning or bias report, he heard Danielle's voice in the back of his mind, reminding him that silence is only powerful when you choose the right moment to break it. Back in Los Angeles, Rachel Cruz stood at the front of Wilson Hall, a new class of recruits sitting in front of her. She didn't stand with the same commanding presence Danielle had. She didn't need to. She had learned that power doesn't come from mimicking a legend. It comes from carrying the lesson forward in your own voice. On the wall behind her, the metal plaque remained untouched. Respect is not a rank. It comes from action. Cruz pointed to the plaque as she opened the first session. "You're going to hate me by the end of this course," she told them, her voice steady but sharp, "because I'm not here to make you comfortable. I'm here to make you listen." And when the recruits glanced nervously toward the plaque again, she knew the lesson had already begun. Far from the city noise, Danielle walked alone down a quiet residential street, the cool breeze tugging at the edge of her jacket. She carried no badge, no rank, no title, just the knowledge that somewhere out there, a generation was being built differently, one that wouldn't make the same mistakes, one that wouldn't laugh when someone who didn't fit their mold tried to speak, a generation that might just listen the first time. She stopped at the edge of a small park, leaning against the railing as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The air smelled of asphalt and sea salt behind her. The city carried on as it always had, but somewhere deep in its bones, it was already different. Danielle reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper, folding and unfolding it like she had done 100 times before. The final line was the one that mattered most, the one she had lived by long before the world had ever bothered to listen. Respect is not a rank. It comes from action. She let the paper fall back into her pocket as she turned to walk away, leaving behind nothing but the memory of a lesson still echoing through every hallway, every badge, every step taken by those who dared to question what they had once accepted without thought. And maybe, just maybe, they would carry it far enough to change something more than just themselves. Sometimes the loudest moments are the ones no one hears, not the headlines, not the cameras, not even the people standing closest to the truth. Danielle Reed's story was never about glory. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving who was right or wrong in a single moment of national attention. It was about something much bigger. It was about what happens when someone chooses to stand their ground, not with fists, not with titles, but with the kind of quiet courage that forces the world to stop and listen. She didn't walk away with medals. She didn't walk away with promotions. She walked away knowing she had shifted something deeper than any ceremony could ever acknowledge. A generation of officers now trains differently because one woman refused to let their system bury another truth. A forgotten veteran, written off as broken, now stands tall in a recovery program that didn't exist until she demanded it. And a man who once embodied arrogance and bias now sits quietly in a forgotten office in Montana, not as punishment, but as a reminder that the hardest lessons are the ones you never get to teach, only live through. Danielle never asked to be remembered. She asked to be heard. And the beauty of her story is that it doesn't end with her. It begins with everyone who chooses to carry that same lesson forward. Because change doesn't happen in one building, one city, or one moment of crisis. Change happens in the small, almost invisible choices we make every day. The choice to listen before reacting. The choice to question before assuming. The choice to act with integrity when no one's watching. Across cities and towns. In classrooms and precincts. In boardrooms and living rooms. People like you are faced with those same choices every single day. You may not be standing at a hostage scene. You may not be holding the power to stop a SWAT team with 5 words. But you hold something just as powerful, the ability to decide whether you'll be the one who ignores the quiet voice on the sidelines or the one who stops to listen. So let me ask you, now that you've heard Danielle's story, what would you have done if you had been there that day, standing behind the barricades or watching from the other side of a screen? Would you have dismissed her because of how she looked? Would you have joined the laughter, or would you have dared to ask, who is she, and what does she see that the rest of us don't? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know how this story made you think differently. Did it challenge your perspective? Did it make you reflect on moments when you could have listened more closely to the people around you? And if you found something valuable in this story, something that makes you believe in the power of listening, of leading differently, of standing up when it matters, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us why justice doesn't start with a badge or a title. It starts with the courage to act when the world is too busy looking the other way. Because at the end of the day, respect isn't something you wear. It's something you prove. And the next time the world gets quiet enough to hear one voice cutting through the noise, ask yourself, will you be the one who listens?